what I'll be using as the sources for those who are joining via Zoom. They're not the most user-friendly sources. That's all in Hebrew. But in case you do want them, I'll put them into the chat. I'm going to be explaining everything and not really reading much from the sources. So it's not really going to be a hindrance at all as far as understanding the shir is concerned. But it's going to, if you want to see it for yourself, it's all right there. Okay. Now, what I put into the chat is really a bigger topic. I'm really just focusing in on one part of it, as you'll see. Okay, so let's begin. So the point that I want to address in today's shir is, and bear with me, this is my first time doing a hybrid shir. I've done Zoom and I've done in person, but I haven't done both at the same time. So I'm going to do my best to make that work, but bear with me. And I am recording. Okay, good. So here we go. So the topic for today's shir is a topic that it's bothered me, and I've been curious about it for a long time, and that is, why do we light inside?
Excuse me, Rabbi, you have to keep speaking directly.
Why is it only in Israel that we find people lighting their menorahs outside? It seems. Oh, I also wanted to, excuse me, before I start, I wanted to turn myself with one other announcement. I want to dedicate this shir to a schos refuah shlema for Esther Hitzel Bas Gittel and Menachem Nachum ben Esther Hitzel, the Deutsches, and Miriam's name I don't recall. Miriam, do you happen to know it? Dr. Horowitz, you can feel free to chime in if you. Oh, Menachem, there you are.
I'm here. How are you? How you getting some other people here? Oh,
yes,
Rabbi,
yes.
Mr. Holt, how beautiful.
I'm dedicating the shir to your refuah shlema.
Wow, there's more important people to dedicate. But especially, it's a pleasure to see your father here. That's so beautiful.
There you go. Okay, so the topic is, why do we light the menorah inside, even in communities that are safe in America, to light it outside? That's really the big question here. And maybe a bigger question is, why in Israel do they do it one way, and in Chutz La'aretz they do it a different way? Like, why is that? And when you look at the sources, it's hard. When you start at the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch, it's very strange. So that's why I want to start there, explain the question a little better, and then delve into some of the sources for the answer to the question. So first off is the Gemara in Shabbos and Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Beis. And the Gemara there lays out something very, very straightforward. This is towards the middle of the page. The last line of the word is Tanur Rabbanan, right where you have the little Gimel and Ches together on the right side of the page. The word before that, Tanur Rabbanan. Ner Chanukah mitzvah anichal Pesach beisam ibachutz. The Ner Chanukah, the mitzvah is to put it outside, next to your door. Emhaya darba aliyah, if you live in an apartment on a second story, so you don't have a door to put it there. You don't have a door facing out to the street. So what are you supposed to do? You put it in your window. Put it in your window facing out. Here are the critical words. In times of danger, you put it on your table, and that is sufficient. Okay? Okay, that's it. We can pause right there. That's the Gemara. So the Gemara sounds very, very clear. The ideal place for your menorah is outside your front door. If you don't have a front door because you live in an apartment, you put it in your window. But the window is only for someone who doesn't have a front door. If you have a front door, you put it outside next to your door. That's very clear from the Gemara. And only if it would be dangerous to do that, should you put it on your table, and that's good enough. That's another important thing to point out, is that the Gemara mentions putting it on your table. It doesn't say anything about put it inside so that it could be seen from the street. That seems to be an oxymoron, right? That doesn't make sense. Make up your mind. If you have decided it's dangerous, then you don't want it to be public. You don't want it to be visible to the public. If you've decided that it's not dangerous and that it should be visible to the public, you've got no business putting it inside. It should be outside. That we only see two options in the Gemara. That is what seems to be clear from the Gemara. Now, one more thing before we leave the Gemara is a Tosfos here. Shas HaSakana. It's a short Tosfos. I'll just paraphrase Tosfos' point. Tosfos says, what is the Gemara referring to? Shas HaSakana. There was a practice in the times of when the Jewish people lived in Bavel, in Babylonia. The Babylonians had a holiday, and one of the laws in the Babylonian idolatry was that there is not allowed to be any lights except for in their temple. And it was a very serious thing, and they would go around and make sure that there's no lights in any houses, because there's only supposed to be light in their idol's temple. That was a specific time that it was very dangerous for a Jew to have any light in his house. And it was specifically that scenario, says Tosfos, that the Gemara is referring to. That was the Shas HaSakana.
Rabbi Alt?
When they would coincide. Go ahead, Menachem.
Did this holiday just coincidentally always happen to fall around Hanukkah time?
Good question.
I was under the impression, and I don't know anything about Zoroastrianism, but I thought that had something to do with, they had a strict separation between light and dark. And I didn't know that it was actually a holiday that was Dafka happened to fall around Hanukkah. I thought it was just part of the Zoroastrian religion that they, you were either you had to be light or dark, and there was no, inside your house maybe was different.
Yeah.
No,
a good question, Nachum. I did not research exactly when this practice was done in Bavel, but the point that Nachum's raising is, did it always line up with Hanukkah? Seems to be, that's an interesting point. Either in their calendar, it always lined up with Hanukkah, and just it was only not all Jews lived in a location where that was practiced, or it might have depended from year to year, depending on how the two calendars coincided. I'm not really sure. But that is what Tosfos says that the Gemara is referring to. Now, the next point to move on is to the Shulchan Aruch. That's in Siman Tafresh Ayin Aleph. For you guys here in person, it's the second page of the handout. And this is really I did. I
only unmute when I have a question.
Okay, so there we go. So in the Shulchan Aruch, we have in Siman Tafresh Ayin Aleph, the Gemara, the Shulchan Aruch paskins this Gemara very straight out with no adjustments. The Shulchan Aruch here in Sif Hey, kind of starting in the middle, he says, let's just take it from the top to make it easy. Sif Hey. You put it by your door that faces the public. Outside. Assuming that the house opens up to the public thoroughfare. If you have a courtyard, you put it by the door of the courtyard. If you live on a second story, you do not have a door open to the public. Then you put it in the window that faces out to the public. Exactly what we saw in the Gemara. And in times of danger, where you're not able to fulfill this, you put it on your table, and that is sufficient. So the Shulchan Aruch paskins this Gemara exactly as it appears, without any adjustments at all. Now, if we continue, you can go to now the first page I gave you. This is now starting with what I put on the chat on Olamot. So this would be on page 10 of that. I would do share screen, but I think it's going to get too complicated. And And I'll explain what's happening here. The Ramah continues. This is now the Ramah in the same siman, Tafresh Ein Aleph, but now this is in Sif Zayin. And the Ramah says, Bizman hazeh shekulonu madlikim bifnim. That's how the Ramah begins. Nowadays, when everyone lights indoors, so he writes, nowadays that everyone's lighting indoors, you don't really need to worry about where exactly you put the menorah. It doesn't make such a big difference. He writes, nonetheless, it's still good to put it by the door, not outside, but inside, and opposite the mezuzah, to keep the old minhag. That's what the Ramah writes. Menachem has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, does the Rambam, when he codifies, does he make any mention of this concern of the Tosos brought? I mean, it could be our minhag of lighting inside is a carryover. We often see that somehow what happened in Bavel becomes the model for all Galus communities. And Bavel had a particular issue here. But I'm curious if the Rambam, had any awareness or any mention of this Chutz La'aretz issue, based on a Bavel thing, or maybe he just had no awareness of it, and felt that even in Chutz La'aretz he should be lighting outside also. Somehow he missed that whole issue.
Got it. Okay, so Menachem's asking about specifically how the Rambam brings this down. I'm almost positive that the Rambam brings down the Gemara exactly the way it is, exactly like the Shulchan Aruch does. That you light your menorah outside unless it's dangerous to do that. Then you can light your menorah inside, and that's good enough. That's exactly how the Rambam brings it down as well. Now, the Mishnah Berurah here, continuing now, the Mishnah Berurah at the top of this, the page that we were just talking about, which is in Siman Tafresh Ein Aleph. This is the Mishnah Berurah in Sifkat Lamed Ches. So the Ramah just said, even though we're lighting inside nowadays, and therefore it doesn't really matter so much where you put it, because you're not trying to, make it clear to people out on the street, which is the whole reason why the Gemara said to put it by your door, was for people to see from the street. Once you're lighting a menorah inside, doesn't really matter, still keep it next to your door opposite the mezuzah. The Mishnah Berurah says, however, if you can make it visible to the street from inside your house, how would you do that? By putting it by the window. And the Mishnah Berurah adds, unless you're going to put yourself in danger by doing that. So that is what you should do. So now the Mishnah Berurah jumps in, the Chafetz Chaim, the Mishnah Berurah, and he makes everything confusing. And he says that really you should put it, even though you're lighting a menorah inside, you should put it at your window so people can see it from the street. I see your hand, Menachem, 1 minute. So people can see it from the street, assuming that's not dangerous. So now the big question is, clearly, it's not so dangerous to people know that you're lighting a menorah, in whatever time the Chafetz Chaim was talking about, because he's recommending putting it by the window. But if that's the case, why don't you just put it outside altogether? That's the question. So we really see this question clear in the Mishnah Berurah. Do you want to say something, Binyo? Well, because what? Because then even the family won't see it well, you're saying. Oh, so meaning it should, Dav could be by the chutzner, you're saying, by the door of the chutzner? Interesting. Okay, that's really a whole different question about, I don't know. In their day, I think it was. I don't know. I'm not sure. Not sure what the Metzius was then. But but that's a fascinating point. How visible would it be? Okay, Menachem also had a question. Go ahead, Menachem.
I'm sorry. So not to belabor this point, but I think it's the essence of your whole question is the Ramah. We see that the Ramah, we have this this leap of faith that somehow the minhag of Bavel, which should have been conditional on danger, somehow we've jumped into the Ramah, in the year 1580 or 1600 or whenever the Ramah was there, that now we all like inside danger or no danger. That's the whole thing.
Yes.
Like, what's missing here? How did it become that the Bavel model, which is based on a very particular problem, which is not necessarily applicable in all cases, but the Ramah just picks up and says, well, we all are light inside now, without any explanation of how that became
right.
the thing. That's the essence of your whole shir. But that's the missing link here to the
That question. Is the missing link. That is exactly right, Menachem. Okay, thank you for.
All right, thank you.
That's really what I want to focus on, is filling in that missing link. That we have exactly as Menachem put it, that there seems to be this. The Ramah seems if we start with the Gemara, that it's only for one particular reason that you light your menorah inside. All of a sudden, the Ramah makes it sound like Bisman Hazeh, that's what you do, no matter what. And the Mishnah Berurah really makes the problem even bigger, because the Mishnah Berurah is even talking about putting it by your window. What's going on here? Why are we lighting the menorah inside if we're comfortable publicizing it? That's the question. So now this question really goes very far back, even before the Ramah and the Mishnah Berurah. Which makes it clear that obviously this minhag predated the Ramah, because the Ramah is just citing it. But the Or Zarua is one of the Rishonim, and the Or Zarua asked the question, but he doesn't answer it. The Or Zarua writes, "V'ha'ibna, nowadays, the leka sakana, where there's no danger, lo yadana my taima inon madlikim b'chatzeros." I don't know. Okay, I don't. Says the Or Zarua, I don't know why we don't light our menorahs in our courtyards. Why do we light our menorahs inside? I just don't know why. That's the Or Zarua. So the Or Zarua asked that question. The Or Zarua leaves it as a question. But what do we see here? We see two important things. Number one is we see that this minhag of lighting inside. I see what you're holding up, Lenny. I think my mask is the problem. Yeah, he's having trouble hearing me. I think everyone else is able to hear me. Okay. Anyways,
I'm hearing you just perfectly fine. So.
That's good.
Sorry,
okay.
Glenn.
And Tyler can also hear me fine. That's good. Okay. If anyone else can't hear me, maybe you should try to boost up your volume or something. Okay. So the Or Zarua is a very early source that asks a question and leaves it as a question. But we see two very important things. Number one, we see clearly that this minhag of lighting inside, despite a lack of sakana, goes very early. It goes all the way to the Or Zarua, all the way to the Rishonim. The second thing that we see is the Or Zarua didn't do anything about it, which is a very interesting thing. He didn't say, okay, everybody, let's make a campaign, let's revolutionize, let's all put our menorahs outside. He did not do that, which is significant. Okay, let's move on now. The Itter, the Sefer Itter, which is also a very early source, he doesn't explain it, but he just writes, once that has become the minhag because of a sakana, we keep that as the minhag. And we're going to give perhaps some potential explanations for why that is, but he doesn't explain it. He just says it as a fact of life. Once that shift occurred, once the menorah moved indoors for a legitimate reason because of a sakana, and that became the minhag, that remained the minhag. That is the Sefer Itter. So now let's get to the meat and the potatoes here. Some theories, some ideas of why this might be. So perhaps the most authoritative, but I found it to be a little bit not so satisfying, is the Aruch HaShulchan. The Aruch HaShulchan is, one of the most authoritative, more contemporary halachic works. And the Aruch HaShulchan, right here, he addresses this issue, and he writes that even though it's not necessarily dangerous anymore, however, he says that it's just not practical, it's not feasible, because he says that the time of year that Hanukkah falls out, in all of our communities in Europe, the weather is terrible. It's raining, it's snowing, it's windy. You want to light some candles outside? It's not going to work. It's just simply not going to work. And therefore, he says, that's why we light our menorah indoors. And the interesting, he addresses the obvious question, which is, wait a minute, light it outside and put it in a box. Don't you, in Eretz Yisrael, you go to Israel, it's they've got problems with wind. They may not have problems with snow, at least most years, but they've got problems with wind. So what do? They got their little glass box and they light the menorah in there. The Aruch HaShulchan is not a fan of a glass box. And he says, number one, he says, we don't find that was ever required, that you have to create a contraption to protect your menorah. We don't find that the Chazal required us to do that. So therefore, he says, if it's that type of setting that would be needed, then you have every right to light your menorah inside. The second thing he says, which he doesn't really explain, I don't fully understand this, he writes that you're going to lose the hecker of the mitzvah. It's not going to be clear that this is, clear that this is a mitzvah. So maybe, I'm not sure what he means by that. Maybe what he means is that it will resemble a lantern. When you encase your menorah in a glass box, it resembles a lantern. And you find in halacha many, many places where we're trying to avoid any thoughts that this is not for a mitzvah, but this is just regular light, which is a problem with a menorah, if you think about it, especially before electricity. What did people use for light? They used candles. So how's anyone going to know that this is for a mitzvah? So we light it in a funny height and a funny location. We try to do things to make it clear that it's for a mitzvah. And perhaps that's what the Aruch HaShulchan means, that if you put it in a glass box, it's not clear that it's for a mitzvah. And therefore, the Aruch HaShulchan says to light it inside. Now, yeah, go ahead, Menachem.
So I wonder if there are, I can see the second objection. I wonder if the first objection is connected to the idea that you have to, when you light, it has to be ready to actually burn. If you don't put enough oil, then you weren't Yotze. Or if you put it in a windy place, then you're not Yotze. So I wonder if that's what he's relying on there, that if it wasn't going to work for the 30 minutes at the time that you did it, then you're not Yotze the mitzvah. So maybe that's what he was concerned about.
Okay. Well, so he doesn't say that clearly. I think his language, let me explain a little bit better what Menachem's getting at. There's a major halachic issue that's discussed by the Israeli poskim in particular with the way they light menorah in Israel, which is that if you put it in that glass box, especially if it's open when you light it and then you close it. So there's a whole discussion that there's a halachic requirement that when you light, the moment that you're lighting your menorah, it's set up in a way that it should be successful, that it should last. If you light it in a way where it's guaranteed to blow out, you don't fulfill your mitzvah. So there's a major discussion with those glass boxes. If it's really windy and you caught that one moment that the wind died down, you open up the box, you lit it real quick, and then you closed up the box so it wouldn't blow out. There's a whole question that, wait. When you lit it, it wasn't in a scenario that it would stay burning. So maybe you didn't do a proper lighting at all. That is a major discussion. The Aruch HaShulchan doesn't make that argument. He doesn't, at least not clearly. He says the extra legwork, the extra tircha of making a contraption, we never find that requirement in the Gemara, in the Shulchan Aruch. No one ever said there's a mitzvah to make a box and put a menorah in the box. We don't find that. So if you find yourself in a scenario where that's what you have to do, says the Aruch HaShulchan, you don't have to go that far. You can light your menorah inside. That's really his first argument. The second argument is losing the heker mitzvah, that it's not clear that it's for a mitzvah. But Menachem is raising another very significant point, that there is a serious halachic question, depending on the exact scenario, when you're lighting outside and using one of those glass boxes. Oh, thank you, Binyamin. Okay, so Binyamin is asking a really strong question of this whole Aruch HaShulchan, which is, I'm saying in Bavel, in Eretz Yisrael, it's pretty windy. It's not so likely that your candles are not going to blow out. So if they didn't intend for you to put it in a box or some type of protection, when did they ever light outside, right? At what point in history was everyone just lighting outside? It doesn't make sense. That's a really, really good question. I saw that question asked. I forgot who asked that question. It's one of the sources here. And he says, I don't know, maybe the conditions were different, Taka, maybe, I don't know. He doesn't give a straight, clear answer about how to address that. But that's a very strong question, which is a big hole in the Aruch HaShulchan specific approach. Absolutely. Okay, let's continue. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay, so Binyamin's raising another very important point, which is how if we are lighting inside but at the window, how much are we losing? You have the Persumin Nisa, you have the fact that the people on the street can see your menorah. How much worse is it? So that is an important question to think about. I think we still need to come up with some type of excuse, because this is clearly not what the Gemara prescribes. You know what I mean? Like, they wanted it by your door. Right. Yeah, but that's someone who doesn't have a door. Someone who doesn't have a door is being told to put it by the window. Right. So okay. So you're saying that if you're lighting it in your window, you're a lot safer. That's basically what you're saying. If you're lighting it on your table, then you really need to have a good answer to this question. Is that? Right. Okay. Let's continue with some other sources, some very interesting ideas. So the Gaivid of the Eirach HaRedis, Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Weiss, wrote a tshuva in the Minchas Yitzchak, where he addresses this issue, and he makes the point that there's got to be a good reason for this, because he says that he says that in all the generations, we don't find that the tzaddik hador, the leaders, the tzaddikim, ever changed and moved their menorahs outside in times where it was not dangerous. So there's got to be a good reason for this. He comes up with a fascinating source, which is an adjustment to the Gemara. He has a source from the Maseches Megillas Tainis. So he's got a different source, but we're talking about a Talmudic source, which adds a middle tier. When we looked at the Talmud Bavli, when we looked at the Gemara, there's only two extremes, right? There was outside, or there was sakana, it's mamish dangerous, on your table. He has a source here that says, mitzvah la nicha pesach beisa mibachutz, mitzvah to put it outside. So now we're all the way at the bottom. If you're looking at trying to find in the handout, all the way at the bottom, kind of that middle column. It's mitzvah la nicha pesach beisa mibachutz. The mitzvah is to put it outside. The misyare min aleitzim. If you're worried about the leitzim, about the scoffers, the mockers, manicha pesach beisa mibifnim. Then you put it at your door inside. Ubishas sakana, in times of danger, manicha al shulchan v'dayo. Then you put it on your table, and that's good enough. So this, to recap, this Megillus Tainus is adding that there's a middle. You're not worried about danger. Your life is not in danger. But you're misyare mipnei haleitzim. You're worried about the scoffers. Now, it's unclear exactly what that means, but the way I understand it is that you're not in mortal danger, but someone's going to mess with your menorah. If you leave it outside, somebody's going to go mess with it. Someone's going to take it. Someone's going to blow it out. Someone's going to throw an egg at it. Whatever it's going to be. You're in that type of siviva that it's not a good idea to leave your menorah outside. You don't know what's going to happen to it. So then what do? You keep it inside, but you don't take it all the way to the table. Now, what's the difference? To me, I think it's clear. The difference is whether it's able to be seen from outside the house. That's the difference, which is logical, right? So when you're worried about someone messing with your menorah, you have a right to put it inside the house, but you try to do that in a way where it's visible. When you're worried about danger, if someone finds out you're lighting menorah, your life will be in danger, then you got to hide it. It's got to be on your dining room table. you put it on your dining room table, and you keep it hidden from sight. Keep it hidden from the public sight. This is perfect. This source really lines up perfectly with what we're doing, where you can never be too sure in most of our neighborhoods, so therefore, what do? You keep it safe inside your house, but you make it visible. So this is really beautiful. This source really solves all of our problems right then and there. The only room to argue, to kind of think about are communities that are really, really isolated communities, which might explain why in Israel it became prevalent to light outside, because there are certain communities that are very isolated. But in America, you have to think about, maybe New Square, maybe certain really, really isolated communities that would be allowed to do it. There are poskim who talk about the ghettos. Maybe in the ghettos, they should have lit the menorahs outside. As ironic as that sounds, the argument is, if it's totally isolated, it's a gated community, it shouldn't really matter why. If no one's coming in, then you should be lighting outside. But that's the idea of the scoffers. He has, I just want to share with you, this Minchas Yitzchak has a beautiful point that he adds on from the Svar Kedoshim, the Bnei Yissaschar and others have a point about the menorah kind of projects a certain ruchnius, a certain spiritual power. So he says, in the early generations, we had the power to project out to the streets and to project the Torah out. He says now we're on a lower level. We're projecting to the inside, to our own families. That's the focus. The focus is our own families. And he plays off the idea of the leitzim, because there's an idea, when there's scoffers out there, you're not supposed to rebuke the scoffer because he's not going to listen. You preach to someone who is open to hearing. So, that's why the menorah went from outside to inside. Just kind of a nice hashkafa to add to this halachic discussion. Okay. I'm going to jump now to the Shevet HaLevi, and then we'll come back to the Dvar Yeshua in a minute. So the Shevet HaLevi, Rav Shmuel Wozner, he has a tshuva on this topic as well. And he has a really interesting idea that he puts in here in Chelek Zayin Siman Pei Daled. And he brings in the shul menorah. And he says the following point. He says, now that's an interesting thing. When did that occur in history? When did that start happening? It's an interesting question. I didn't have a chance to dig into this deeply from a historical perspective, but you don't seem to see this in the Gemara. But then it comes up in the Shulchan Aruch as a minhag that we do. We light a menorah in shul for Persumei Nisa, okay, to publicize the miracle. So there you go. There's the shul menorah in Buffalo, New York. Thank you, Dad. So the Shevet HaLevi says an amazing thing. He wants to say, this is what happened. Sakana came along, people lit the menorah inside their house. But now we're losing out on the public version of the menorah. So what do? We light the menorah in the shul. The shul is the place where the community gathers, but it's still safe indoors. Not putting it out, not putting it in their faces, right? It's not in the public view. Once we developed that system of having a minhag of lighting a menorah in shul, now we've accomplished the public scale Persumei Nisa, and now our home menorah only is needed to accomplish the family Persumei Nisa. That's what Shmuel Wozner wants to suggest. A fascinating idea that perhaps the reason why we held on to this minhag was because the Persumei Nisa of sharing it out, the public menorah is accomplished by the shul menorah. And once that goal is being accomplished by the shul menorah, it's not necessary to put it outside. And that's why the minhag was that even when it was no longer dangerous, we kept the menorah inside. Okay, now let's move on to Dvar Yeshua. This is where things get really, really interesting. We'll conclude with this. Just something I want to toss in here. We spoke, there is a difference between the different pshatim that we said about how important is it to put it on your window or to put it on your table, right? And I'll just make an important point. Hasidim do not make an effort to put the menorah in their window. Hasidim will typically, menicha al shulchan v'dayu. They put it on their dining room table and that's it. That is the standard practice amongst Hasidim. So there will be, depending on which approach we take, there's going to be a question as to whether that's okay or not okay. Certainly.
Pardon me.
Yes.
I noticed that Chabad will open their front doors and put it opposite the mezuzah with their front doors open.
Okay, that's interesting. So that would be very much in line with the Ramah. And you've got it inside the house. It's an interesting question, with the front door open, is it safe or is it not safe? I think it might depend on who you ask and what?
In Crown Heights, it's very safe.
I don't know if you meant that sarcastically or not. It's the Crown Heights is not the nicest of neighborhoods, but it's pretty heavily Jewish depending on what street you're on. So whatever. I don't know. I'm not an expert in Crown Heights safety, but be that as it may, so far, let's just recap because we already covered right now the three primary sources. We have the Aruch HaShulchan, that weather is the issue. And if that's your issue, then really it's ideal to put it by the window. Now, he didn't make a point of that. He might take a position that once you're not putting it outside, you're not obligated to make it publicly visible. But certainly, it would seem that would be ideal. The Minchas Yitzchak, certainly he's coming from a source that there are 3 levels. For him, I would think it's almost an obligation to make it visible unless you're in mortal danger. And then finally, this idea of, what was the other one? The Shevet HaLevi. The Shevet HaLevi would perhaps be a justification to even put it on your dining room table, because you're accomplishing the publicity with the shul menorah, so then to put it in your window is not really necessary. That perhaps would be an approach for the Shevet HaLevi. That the Shevet HaLevi would be perhaps a support for that, which would make sense. You know, the Shevet HaLevi was, Hasidish, and did, had some, he'll kind of, try to represent Hasidic minhagim in some of his tshuvas. But he doesn't say that explicitly in this tshuva. So it sounds like it's kind of his general theory. Okay, but moving on, now the Dvar Yehoshua. So the Dvar Yehoshua is a tshuva sefer from the Av Bezin of Tel Aviv. And what's interesting is he writes about when he first moved to Israel, and he was just shocked. He came to Israel, and everyone's laying the menorahs outside. And he's like, what's going on here? Where did this come from? Right? It's a little bit almost an opposite perspective from how we began this year, right? He moves to Israel, and he sees everyone's laying the menorah outside, and he says, what's going on here? Why is everybody doing this? He said, no one's ever done this for so many generations. We've always been lighting our menorahs inside. And he says, come on, the Or Zarua already asked this question, and he didn't change anything. So who came up with this idea? And he's becomes very anti the outdoor menorah even in Israel. And he takes this to an extreme. And he turns to a Gemara in Ksubis, which is real, and he has a very interesting chiddush. The Gemara in Ksubis, it's all in the very beginning of the Masechta. The first mission in the Masechta talks about a very interesting halacha. Basula nises the Yom HaRevi'i. A virgin, a woman that was not previously married, should specifically get married on a Wednesday. Why? Because the Bezdin sits on Thursday. So who cares? So listen to this if you haven't heard this Mishnah before, it is likely that it will surprise you. The Mishnah says, because in case on the wedding night, he'll discover that she's not necessarily the virgin that she claimed to be, we want him to still be upset the next morning and to come to Bezdin. We want that to happen. So we specifically want them to get married the day before the Bezdin sits. So they should get married on a Wednesday. That's why. Why? Because if there's any question, we want it to come to a Bezdin. Let's say they get married on a Monday evening, and then there's a couple days, Tuesday, Wednesday, before the Bezdin sits, maybe he'll cool off and he'll forgive her and he'll go on with life. That could be a big problem. Why would that be a big problem? Because they did marriage very differently than we do it nowadays. They did the Kiddushin first, where they, Hariyat Mekudeshes Li, but they didn't do the chuppah yet. He didn't take her into his house. That would happen a year later. During that time, if he gave her that ring and said, Hariyat Mekudeshes Li, she's his. And if she's with any other man during that time, she becomes forbidden to him. And now he takes her in a year later, and she's not a virgin. She was with somebody else in the meantime. She's forbidden to him. That's a big, big, big problem. So we want to weed out that problem. So we specifically want to catch him when he's upset, so it'll come to a Bezdin, and the Bezdin will be able to investigate and clarify and make sure that there's no issues. That is what we see in this Mishnah. Now, the Gemara later, I don't want to get into all the details, it gets very complicated. But the bottom line is the Gemara later in Ksubas and Daf Gimel and Beis talks about Shasa Sakana. There were certain times in history where it was dangerous to publicize the time or to set a specific time for a Jewish marriage. There, the Gemara talks about times which are very relevant to Hanukkah, times where the non-Jewish officials would take the Jewish bride and she would have to go to be with the general before she went to her husband. Terrible, very tragic times, which happened throughout Jewish history. And there were times where it was even outlawed to conduct a Jewish marriage. And the person could be killed for conducting a Jewish marriage. And for those reasons, the exact timing for Jewish marriage got shifted around. So that is the question. That is, the Gemara discusses that. And the bottom line is, the Gemara says that minhagim developed to get married on different days because of that. But in the course of the discussion, the Gemara says, if what we're really worried about here is a real sakana, someone's going to get killed, they wouldn't just allow a different minhag to develop. They would have uprooted the whole takana. They would have uprooted the very decree to get married on a Wednesday. Uprooted the whole thing. That's what the Gemara says. And this, the Dvar Yehoshua brings the Shita Mekubetzes, who explains that Gemara, they would have done away with the whole thing. And even in a later generation where there's no mortal danger, they would not have brought it back. Because maybe it would become dangerous once again at some later point. And if that ever would happen, they would never bring it back. So the Dvar Yehoshua says, aha, I've got it. That's exactly what I need for my menorah. He says that's the pshat. At one point in history, it became mortally dangerous to publicize lighting a menorah, right? Nazi Germany, for sure. But much earlier than that in history, Babylonian times, other times, it became mortally dangerous to let anybody know you're lighting a menorah. At that point, they uprooted the whole thing. No more menorah outside. And he says, based on this, they uprooted in a way that it would not come back. The menorah should stay inside, just like it seems clear from this Gemara that if they would uproot the institution of getting married on a Wednesday, they would never bring it back. That is his theory. That is his, not just a theory, that's his psak. And he concludes his tshuva by saying that if somebody lights the menorah outside, they may not be Yosef. That's how far he goes, which is really, really extreme. That is the Dvar Yehoshua. Now, this Dvar Yehoshua, a tremendous chiddush, a fascinating pshat, but as you can imagine, the Israeli poskim, who now are on the defensive, take issue with this tshuva. So both the Ashkenazic and the Sephardic, the top guns, fire at will. And Rav Eliashiv from the Ashkenazim and Rabbi Yosef from the Sephardim, they take serious issue with this Dvar Yehoshua. First of all, they say that what he is suggesting is impossible. And they make a very strong argument. And they say, excuse me, Dvar Yehoshua, Shulchan Aruch and Rambam. You've got a Ramah that you're trying to explain. Very nice. But let's not forget about the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam. What do the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam write? Exactly the Gemara as it's stated. Clearly, they are proponents. They are at least okay, supportive of an idea of letting a menorah outside if it's not dangerous. That's what they wrote. So what did they have in mind? When Mashiach will come, that's what they meant? Hilchos of the Mashiach, says the Rav Eliashiv, a kind of a sarcastic stab at the Dvar Yehoshua. That's what they meant? Of course not. So therefore, he says, both Rav Eliashiv and Rabbi Yosef say, it is impossible to say that you're not Yotze by lighting outside. That much is not acceptable. And to say that the institution of lighting a menorah outside was uprooted entirely is not possible. And then they make two more arguments. Rabbi Yosef points out, if you look at the language of the Gemara, there's a very clear difference. The language of the Gemara in Kesubis is Mishas Hasakana ve'eloch. From the times of danger and on, we would not get married on a Wednesday. You could get married on other days. The language of the Gemara regarding menorah is b'shas hasakana, in times of danger. It doesn't say anything about beyond that point. So says Rabbi Yosef, you look at the Gemara itself, the Gemara tells you there's a difference. The Gemara in Ksubas tells you that this change would be permanent, mishasa kind of an eloch, times of danger and on, whereas the change regarding menorah is not continuing. It's shas hasakana. It's only when in times of danger that we would make this change. That is, Rabbi Yosef makes that argument. And Rabbi Yosef also, I'm trying to remember now, he explains why the two scenarios would be very different, why it doesn't make sense, why the logic doesn't flow. The logic wouldn't apply. The logic of the case in Ksubis would not apply to a menorah. Give me 1 second. Okay. He also makes a very strong point that we mentioned at the beginning of this year, very early sources, the Or Zarua and the Itter, who both ask this question, and they don't say this answer from the Gemara in Ksubis. So Rabbi Yosef says, like, we haven't shown him on the table that are not following this approach. So he says that it's very difficult to take this approach, and therefore they both conclude that it's totally acceptable to light your menorah outside, and that the Israeli minhag should be maintained. But they also both conclude that the minhag of lighting the menorah inside does have adequate justification, and someone does not need to be concerned that bisman hazeh, they're not yotze by lighting inside. That's the point there. Oh, it was the Or L'Tzion. Very good. Okay, so you know what? I'm going to conclude the shir with that point. If anyone wants to go, I thank you very much for joining me. I wish you a Chanukah Sameach, a Freilich and Chanukah. I'll stay on if anyone wants to ask any questions. But thank you all for joining, and I wish you a Freilich and Chanukah. Shukayach, Julian. Thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed. Okay. Tyler asked me to stay on for some questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, we can stay on till 5:30 for questions if anybody's got any.
Thank you, Rabbi Al.
Sure. Thank you for joining. Glad to see that you were up to it, Menachem. Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you.
A couple points.
Yeah, go ahead.
One, that Hanukkah falls usually over the darkest, shortest day of the year, which, with the Zoroastrian, with the light in the dark. Two, window glass. In the days of the Talmud, I doubt they had clear glass to make a box outside, and I doubt they had clear glass to have a window like we do. So if they put the menorah in their opening because they had shutters, it wouldn't be any better than having it sitting outside.
Wow, that's a very, very, very good point. That's an excellent point.
Sorry.
You do find a concept of white glass all the way in the Gemara. There's a Gemara in Megillah, actually, I just recently was learning with Reuven Sharon about how one of Zvulun's resources was white glass. I'm by myself now, so I can make myself more comfortable. Was white glass.
Meaning clear?
Yeah, so how clear is that? Not clear to me. That's an excellent suggestion. And maybe that's why it wasn't, so meaning what you're suggesting is maybe that was the only way to make it public. But once you have clear glass, that's a fulfillment of putting the menorah by your door outside. It's the equivalent. That's beautiful. It's fascinating to me that no one made that point. Makes me wonder.
I didn't want to interrupt.
Yeah. No, not at all. Thank you.
Yeah, but the other from the other post game.
That's excellent. That's excellent. I just want to mention one thing. The Binyamin, your point about when did they ever light outside, according to the Aruch HaShulchan, that weather is the issue. Who asked that question? The Or L'Tzion. The Chacham, another, it's your Sephardic blood that brought the question out. He doesn't, I don't think he answers it. It's in the handout. He says, V'tzarech Ian. That's how he concludes. No, on this question in general. It's the second to last paragraph in it's on the handout.
Mm-hmm. That's clear. It's not only when Shasana. The minhag that they're doing is because of the light that's done inside, not by the window. Why would in America we will light by the window in Shiloh? You know what I'm saying? It's not the fact that the conversation like.
Meaning they were not necessarily ever bothered by the window. Yeah. Whatchamacallit, Binyamin Abraham make another point. This lines up with something my father just mentioned. He said maybe in the Zman of the Gemara they didn't have clear windows. Yeah, maybe they just Pasha didn't have the Metzius. They didn't have clear windows. So the only way to publicize it was to put it outside. But in a Hanami, if you had a clear window, then that would be the exact equivalent, and there'd be absolutely nothing wrong with that. That'd be just as good. What Binyamin Abraham is adding is that the earliest sources who asked this question go all the way back to the Rishonim, the Or Zarua and the Sefer HaItter. It's very and they're not addressing lighting a menorah in a window. They're addressing lighting a menorah on your dining room table, and that's what they're baffled. Like, why are we doing this? It's very possible that if they would have seen someone light the menorah in a window, they never would have had an issue with that. Yeah. Okay, Shekoyach. Okay, I'm glad you enjoyed. Okay, does anyone else have any other questions before we sign off?
Just one last comment that Mefarsim was tied to how late you can light the menorah, and that's tied with while there are still people in the marketplace. So that just reiterates how important it is to have the menorah exposed to the public.
Yeah, absolutely. But the ironic thing is, I wanted to get to this in the shir. I didn't have a chance to mention this, is that there's a shift in halacha in many different applications because of this change. When the menorah moved indoors, many halachas changed, and one of them is timing. The poskim write, this is based on a Tosfos, goes all the way back to Tosfos. Yeah. Nowadays that we light the menorah inside, what's the primary function of our publicity? It's our own family. Right. That's the primary function. Once that's the case, we don't have to be quite as careful about the timing. If we end up lighting the menorah a little bit later, as long as the family is present, that's okay. That's what we find in the poskim. So it seems like when the menorah moved inside, the aspect of publicizing it to the street became like an add-on. Mm-hmm. It's no longer essential. It's now an add-on. That's the point there. But that is an interesting and important point. Okay. Already, Shekayach, everyone. Thank you for joining. Yeah, Freilich and Chanukah. And don't forget, I want to thank again Mechon Meir for partnering with us in this Shir series. And I want to thank Achihud, our good friend, formerly known as Tyler Cox, for partnering with us in this, helping arrange all the different Israeli speakers. And we'll continue with the Shir series, 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the rest of the week, and 7 p.m. Israeli time for the rest of the week, with a bonus shir for Americans on Monday night at 8 p.m., given by none other than Rabbi Baruch Leff, who now is living in Baltimore, Maryland, a former Cincinnatian, a noted author and Torah teacher. And I really hope that everyone can take advantage of that Wednesday night at 8 p.m., same channel. Alrighty, thank you very much. Have a Freilich and Chanukah, and thank you again for joining. And finally, may this be a schos